Welcome, everyone. We're pleased to have you with us this evening. I'm Trinity Lescalette, the Adult Programming Manager at the Tiffin Seneca Public Library in Tiffin, Ohio. We have people joining us from all around the world tonight, so I thought we better make clear what state we're in. So tonight's event is co-hosted by the library and by the Heidelberg University English Department with the support of Brooks and Jean Warren Geckler. Their generosity with the Heidelberg University Department of English has made this series possible. So first, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Ellen Schaible is Associate Professor of English at Bridgewater State University in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. Her research interests include Irish studies, British modernism, modern Gothic fiction, the domestic interior, and the post-colonial body. In her current work, Dr. Schaible explores representations of gender and sexuality within the discourse of homes and homelessness in Irish fiction, the role of homemaking in configurations of the nation in 20th century writing, and the influence of the Gothic tradition on modern subjectivity. Dr. Schaible was a Moore Institute visiting fellow at the National University of Ireland, Galway. Previously, she was awarded a Marion and Jasper Whiting Foundation Fellowship to support research in Dublin. She is a BSU Commonwealth Honors Faculty Fellow and the coordinator of the Bridgewater State University Irish Studies Program. She has published on Oscar Wilde, James Joyce, and others. She's co-editor of Rethinking Joyce's Dubliners. Now, next, I would like to introduce Dr. Barry Devine. Dr. Devine is an assistant professor of English at Heidelberg University. He has been teaching at Heidelberg for 4 years, and he is a specialist in the works of James Joyce and Irish modernism, and is a contributor to the forthcoming The Cambridge Centenary Ulysses. Dr. Devine is proud to have earned his MA from James Joyce's alma mater, University College Dublin. His general research interests focus on the manuscripts, notebooks, and letters of modernist authors. Dr. Devine is currently researching James Joyce's revisions to Ulysses during the final 6 months before publication in February of 1922. So I'd like to explain how this partnership started. Last fall, Dr. Devine reached out to me about partnering to present a lecture series on Tiffin native John Quinn. To be honest, I was not familiar with Mr. Quinn. Since then, I have learned more about his connection to our area and his accomplishments, and I am delighted that we are able to collaborate with Heidelberg University to share more about Mr. Quinn with our community and with all of your communities around the world. So Dr. Devine, please tell us a little bit about John Quinn.
All right, thank you, Trinity. And thank you for everybody who's joining us. I see a lot of names that I know. I see a lot of names I'm not familiar with, so thank you for coming. So thanks for joining us in the first of what we hope is going to be a long-running series of lectures. Here at Heidelberg University, I teach modern British and Irish literature. But today we're going to be talking about John Quinn and James Joyce. I'll start with about 15 minutes of history about Quinn and his relationship with Joyce, after which I'll turn things over to our special guest, Dr. Ellen Schaible. And then we'll open for questions. We'll have probably about 30 or 40 minutes for questions afterwards. So having studied James Joyce since I was an undergraduate, I became familiar with the name John Quinn in reference to the famous New York trial that ended the serial publication of Ulysses. I'll talk about that shortly. And I knew that Quinn was a benefactor who helped support James Joyce financially by purchasing his manuscripts. And I also knew that Quinn was involved with a few other Irish and modernist writers. And it turns out I only knew the tip of the iceberg. But it wasn't until after I was hired here at Heidelberg University in Tiffin, Ohio, that I learned John Quinn was born right here in Tiffin. And his family most likely lived just a few blocks from my house. I'm still in the process of trying to find the exact location. So this local connection, this local connection inspired me to learn more about Quinn, his early days in Tiffin, and how he got from a town surrounded by cornfields to a life surrounded by wealth and some of the world's most famous authors and artists. And so this is how the John Quinn Lecture Series was born. There's so much about Quinn to share with the local community and with those from afar interested in the works of the artists and writers he worked with. And so one event would not be enough, and that's where the series came from. So at the encouragement of Ruth Wallstrom, whose name I saw pop up on the list, and Nancy Rubenstein, both retired from Heidelberg University, I contacted Trinity at the Tiffin Seneca Library. So without Trinity's help, none of this would be happening. So thank you, Trinity. We plan to host an event each fall and spring, and occasionally a summer event. We're working on the plans for one this summer. We'll share that with you as soon as we can. So let's get started with some information about John Quinn. There we go. So today I'm going to start in presentation mode. Today I'm going to start where John Quinn began, which is right here in Tiffin, Ohio. So Quinn's father, James, immigrated from County Limerick and worked as a baker here in town. His mother, Mary Quinlan, came from County Cork at age 14. 4 years later, the two were married and eventually had 8 children. John was the oldest child. The Quinn family moved 15 miles west of Tiffin to a town called Fostoria about a year after John was born. There, James expanded his bakery business and built the Quinn Block. Here's a photo of the Quinn Block. This is a building on North Main Street in Fostoria that still bears his name. It's hard to read, but you can see the name Quinn Block at the top there. I'm pointing at my screen so you can see it. So the family ran the business at street level and lived in the stories above. Later in his life, Quinn reminisced about Fostoria to a friend of his, calling it, quote, small, flat, uninteresting, and smelly. Those are Quinn's words, not mine. So if you're from Fostoria, don't send me angry emails. So Quinn's relationship with his father was very strained, but he was very close to his mother. Benjamin Reed, the author of Quinn's award-winning and very readable biography, which I highly recommend, describes Mary Quinn as, quote, the real force in the family, a person of intellect and ambition, much admired in the town for her self-taught culture and shrewd common sense. So Mary, his mother, was the primary influence on her son's interests in literature and art. Quinn began collecting his first editions of novels by writers like Walter Pater and Thomas Hardy while he was still in high school. He invested over $100 of his childhood savings. That was a tremendous sum for the 1880s to start his collection. Quinn once wrote to a friend, he said, "I became a collector of books almost as soon as I ceased to be a collector of marbles and gave my marbles and bicycle away." Quinn also got involved in politics before he was even old enough to vote. He ran the campaign for then Governor Foster in his bid to return to Congress. Foster lost that election, but was selected as Secretary of the Treasury in Benjamin Harrison's cabinet. Foster pulled Quinn out of college a year later at the University of Michigan to serve as his private secretary in Washington, D.C. After Quinn completed his law degree at Georgetown, he quickly moved to Massachusetts and earned a second law degree from Harvard, all before his 25th birthday. And while at Harvard, there's Charles Foster. While at Harvard, he also studied philosophy and aesthetics with William James and George Santayana. I feel like I need a pause for the oohs and ahs after that. He then moved to New York City to begin his successful career as a lawyer, art collector, patron, and staunch opponent of censorship. Shortly before his first trip to Ireland in 1902, he was told of his mother's failing health. And so he quickly returned to Fostoria, but did not make it in time to see her again. At every stop between New York City and Fostoria, Quinn sent a telegram to his mother telling her how much he loved her and that he was on his way home. Telegraph operators along the route began to talk to each other about his messages and followed his journey closely. The Fostoria telegraph operator contacted the Quinn family the next day to tell them how touched they were by Quinn's messages and offered condolence on behalf of all of the operators along the route. 4 days later, his sister Annie also died of heart problems. So Quinn left for his first trip to Ireland, deeply shaken and in mourning. So skipping ahead a few years in Quinn's life, he sent an angry letter to Ezra Pound, which will be the subject of a future event. But this angry letter strangely began a long professional relationship between the two. And in coordination with Pound, he began to support James Joyce. Joyce was developing a reputation as a literary genius, so Quinn began to purchase Joyce's manuscripts before they had even met. Quinn purchased the typescript of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, as well as an early draft of Joyce's play Exiles in 1917. Quinn wrote to Joyce and expressed his concern about the play's subject matter, infidelity. And then Joyce, in his typical fashion, poked fun at Quinn's squeamish reaction behind his back by writing a limerick about Quinn in a letter to his friend Claude Sykes. The letters MS in this poem that you'll see stand for the word manuscript. Joyce wrote, "There's a donor of lavish largesse who once bought a play in MS. He found out what it all meant by the final installment, but poor scripter was left in a mess." That's the literary genius of the previous century. So despite his reaction to Joyce's subject matter, Quinn remained opposed to censorship and continued to support Joyce's writing. In 1920, Quinn began purchasing Joyce's handwritten manuscripts of Ulysses as he completed the episodes. Quinn had been warning Joyce for 2 years by that point that legal issues would certainly arise regarding the publication of Ulysses and that fighting it in court would be hopeless. He encouraged Joyce to stop the serial publications for fear that it would doom the eventual publication of a complete novel. Quinn's fears proved well-founded. The Little Review, an American literary magazine run by Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap. There they are. They had been publishing the serial installments of Ulysses. The magazine was sued in late 1920 by the New York Society for the Prevention of Vice. Quinn defended the publishers, Anderson and Heap, despite his knowing that the law was not on their side. He knew that he would lose the case, but he hoped to at least salvage the opportunity for Joyce to publish the complete novel at a later date. Knowing Margaret Anderson's fierce and outspoken defense of Joyce and against censorship, Quinn wisely, as you will soon see, urged her to let him do all the talking in court. During the first day of the trial, the most offending excerpts from Ulysses were read aloud in the courtroom, but one of the judges on the panel asked that it not be read in the presence of Margaret Anderson. Quinn defended her right to be there by stating the obvious to the court, quote, "But she is the publisher," he said. The same judge responded that Anderson clearly didn't understand what she was publishing, and this infuriated the already furious Anderson. Quinn put up a gallant defense that week and the next, and at one point thought he may have actually turned the judges to the client's side. The lawyer for the plaintiff flew into a rage in the courtroom about the offensive nature of Joyce's novel. Quinn quickly took advantage of this by saying to the judges, "This is my best exhibit. There is the proof that Ulysses does not corrupt or fill people full of lascivious thoughts. Look at him," Quinn said. "His face is distorted with rage. He wants to murder somebody. This is what Ulysses does. It makes people angry. It doesn't tend to drive them into the arms of some siren." While the judges found Quinn's response very funny, they ruled against Anderson and Heap, charged them with a fine of $100, and would have sent them to prison were it not for Quinn's quick thinking, telling the judges that the passages read in court were the most offensive passages in the novel, and that no more of Joyce's work would be published in the Little Review. In her rage, Anderson printed a scathing review of the entire trial in the next edition of the Little Review. This included her furious response that she was not able to say directly to the judges. She wrote, "Since I am the publisher, it may be apropos for me to tell you why I have wanted to publish it more than anything that has ever been offered to me. Let me tell you why." I'm sorry, my stuff is getting in the way of my words. Let me tell you why I regard it as the prose masterpiece of my generation. Let me tell you what it's about and why it was written and for whom it was written and why you don't understand and why it is just as well that you don't and why you have no right to pit the dullness of your brains against the fineness of mine. A page in my script here. It's over here. So John Quinn continued to work with Joyce for the next 2 years, finally meeting Joyce for the first time in Paris in about 2-3 months after the trial. The two would meet several more times and would often take walks to talk about literature and art. In 1924, Quinn became ill early in the year and continued to get worse. By March, he was unable to work from his office, and in June, he was diagnosed with cancer of the liver. John Quinn died less than 4 months later. While his friends and fellow art patrons wanted his massive collection of modern art and rare books to be sold intact, Quinn specified in his will that the collections be sold quickly at auction and that the money be given to his surviving family, primarily his sisters, Julia, also living in New York, and Mary, who was a nun at a convent here in Tiffin. So that is a little bit on John Quinn and his relationship with James Joyce. So now I'll turn things over to Dr. Scheible for a new look at a couple of Joyce's short stories in Dubliners. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barry. So I just want to start by thanking Barry, thanking Heidelberg University for hosting me, and thanking Trinity for all of the hard work that went into organizing this event. It's been really smooth so far, and I'm so grateful for it. And what a lovely day to be able to talk about all of this. I have been informed that you have most likely read some of Dubliners. So I am going to assume that you have been good students and that you have done some of your homework. I'm only discussing 2 stories here, and the presentation kind of goes back and forth between something that might seem kind of academic and something that seems a little bit personal. It is PG-13 at times, so just a heads up for that. But you know, Joyce was way worse than PG-13. So if you know Joyce, you'll be fine with this. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Teaching Joyce and Race at a Public College in Massachusetts. When I was 17, my boyfriend, who was a year older than me and had already started college, came home for winter break with a copy of Richard Ellman's biography of James Joyce. The National Merit Scholar that he was, he decided to pick up some light reading after finishing a seminar in British literature featuring Joyce's writing. I know this might be surprising, but there was a time in my life when my early feminism insisted that I shun canonical male authors, especially pretentious ones like Joyce or Hemingway. I balked at the time he spent engrossed in the biography and told him I would never let a writer like Joyce take up that much of my time. 5 years later, I started graduate school, took a modern British fiction seminar, and fell in love with the enemy. I begin with this story because I teach at a 4-year regional comprehensive university where most of my students are first generation and working class, categories I didn't have words for as a teenager. Many of them are commuters and transfer students, and they remain consistently unsure of their college experience, wondering if college is actually for them and if they belong there. Often their parents work for the state, and they grow up fluent in union loyalty and civic pride. And they aren't always in their late teens when I meet them. Sometimes they're 25 or 30, not quite returning students, but old enough to be impatient with the classroom antics of younger, less responsible learners. I am especially equipped to teach my students because when I was 17, I couldn't have predicted that a year later, at 18, I would be transferring from a fancy New England liberal arts college back home to a local state college in Southern Maryland because the money fell out and my small business owner parents couldn't afford another year of high tuition. But I did know that my parents didn't finish college, that I couldn't pronounce the names of schools like Bowdoin because I'd never heard of them before, and that novels by James Joyce were out of my intellectual price range. Besides the obvious larger academic infrastructure in the late 1990s that fought the culture wars and embraced multiculturalism, pitting Joyce's work against writers who seemed more accessible and more representative of a greater population of readers, I imagine that this early sense I had that Joyce was exclusive and incomprehensible, therefore arrogant and pompous, came from an embedded sense of difference I felt from high school on. I grew up in a rural place where folks dropped out of high school at 14 to run family farms, or they studied mechanics at the tech center, planning to fix cars or work in the service industry after graduation instead of going to college. I read Joyce in my advanced placement classes, and I didn't connect in any way with the prose or the intro lectures setting Joyce up as a beacon of English literature. At that time, I loved Dostoevsky and Sylvia Plath, identifying, or so I thought, with Raskolnikov and Lady Lazarus, never hearing once from a teacher, perhaps because I wasn't listening, that Joyce was Irish or Catholic or the son of an alcoholic or forced to leave school as a young person or fundamentally opposed to marriage or so defensive but proud of his culture that he wanted to heal it through art. I routinely teach within an Irish studies program that I founded at my university, and I teach Joyce every semester, from writing about literature intro classes to graduate seminars, regardless of my course assignments. My students connect to him like family because we focus on his devotion to both a place and an idea, concepts that deeply inform the deep-seated heritage of my New England first-generation classrooms. Understanding Joyce for my students means seeing him as a flawed but fiercely protective writer who actually fought publishers over words like bloody and phrases about women crossing their legs because he refused to abandon the stories he knew could bring change to his soon-to-be nation, and instead chose to confront leftover Victorian prejudices about sexuality and poverty. Boston and Dublin have similar histories when it comes to reckoning with modern progressive ideas and traditional provincial moral values. Hybridity and bifurcation are familiar states of being for my students because their New England is both racially segregated and radically liberal, hyper-educated, as Gabriel Conroy would say, but also regionally poor and often immobilized by addiction. They like it when Joyce calls bullshit on political and economic hypocrisy, and they are particularly entertained by how deep his cultural understanding of Catholicism ran while he hated every bit of its tyranny over Ireland. While Joyce's critique of Catholic tyranny is rampant in Dubliners, it emerges alongside an argument about race, particularly in stories like Araby. Araby is perhaps Joyce's most anthologized short story after The Dead, where Joyce's use of Orientalism alongside his critique of Catholicism defines the story's main progression. For my students, understanding the way that an other might be racialized to benefit a dangerous Catholic agenda connects their New England identity, often seen as Irish, white, and Catholic, to the reality of their experience, which is usually defined through poverty, rural living, and disenfranchisement. It is through a discussion of the home in Araby that Joyce's harsh confrontation of Irish racism emerges. While Joyce's ongoing interest in mirroring the domestic interiors represented in his texts with current issues of national development and struggle surfaces as one of the key tropes in his writing, in Araby, we see the exterior spaces of homes and communities represented within the national debate and personified as images of otherness. The domestic spaces of the story evoke a non-white presence when they, quote, gazed at one another with brown, imperturbable faces, end quote. In Araby, the home, particularly the exterior, punctuates the story. The houses and urban dwelling spaces seem to have feelings, quote, the houses had grown somber, end quote, and can imitate physical attributes, quote, the lamps of the street lifted their feeble lanterns, end quote. The story opens with images of domestic exteriors and interiors. Quote, the former tenant of our house, a priest, had died in the back drawing room, end quote. Only to then turn to the central figure in the story besides the narrator, Mangan's sister, forming a parallel between the girl and the urban environment. The first two paragraphs of the story place Mangan's sister in the central position as metaphor for both home and other. She is the uncanny representation of the narrator's sexual development, an experience that is both intimate and foreign to him, and her brownness is the reflection of the domestic exteriors that frame his childhood. And this is a longer quote from Araby. Quote, I kept her brown figure always in my eye, and when we came near the point at which our ways diverged, I quickened my pace and passed her. This happened morning after morning. I had never spoken to her except for a few casual words, and yet her name was like a summons to all my foolish blood, end quote. The irony in this story is, of course, that we never truly discover Mengen's sister's name. So the boy's stimulation by his experiences with her, the summons to his foolish blood, remain private and repressed within the narrative. Vincent Cheng describes her as, quote, a female blank page, end quote, whose namelessness invites, quote, male inscription, end quote. Much insightful work has emphasized how Mengen's sister becomes a holy grail to our boy narrator. And in that metaphor serves as the iconic image of womanhood for the Catholic patriarchal perspective that dominates the narrator's understanding of his existence. This is clear, especially when he visits the room in his house where the priest died, so that he can meditate on his desire for her. And this is another long quote from Joyce from Araby. Quote, one evening, I went into the back drawing room in which the priest had died. It was a dark, rainy evening, and there was no sound in the house. Through one of the broken window panes, I heard the rain impinge upon the earth, the fine, incessant needles of water playing in the sodden beds. Some distant lamp or lighted window gleamed below me. I was thankful that I could see so little. All my senses seemed to desire to veil themselves. And feeling that I was about to slip from them, I pressed the palms of my hands together until they trembled, murmuring, oh love, many times, end quote. In this space, the boy hears no sound and experiences very little vision. The priest's death chamber redirects our narrator again to the exterior of the home, where the anthropomorphized behavior of the rain, lamps, and windows remind him of what he cannot see inside the domestic interior. Mengen's sister and her feelings, as well as his own death, where he might slip away just like his priest doppelganger who dies in the first story, The Sisters. In her brownness and otherness, Mengen's sister is again only identified outside of the domestic interior. She is the exterior, fragmented, and blinded expression of the home that our narrator will never have. While home becomes the holy chalice in this way, it is also a brown version of itself, an othered kind of home that both excludes the boy and reflects his own outsider position within his aunt and uncle's home. Joyce uses both female sexuality and racial otherness as escapist dreams for a young male narrator who is trapped within a foreign domestic interior. Not only is this an uncanny way for Joyce to expose an Ireland that blinds and deafens its inhabitants, a home that kills its own priests with its Catholicism, but it also fragments the brown female other in the story, similar to the braceleted arms in T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, in order to make this distinction. I think Ezra Pound would be proud of me for quoting Eliot there, Barry. This is another quote from Araby from Joyce. The high, cold, empty, gloomy rooms liberated me, and I went from room to room singing. From the front window, I saw my companions playing below in the street. Their cries reached me weakened and indistinct, and leaning my forehead against the cool glass, I looked over at the dark house where she lived. I may have stood there for an hour, seeing nothing but the brown-clad figure cast by my imagination, touched discreetly by the lamplight at the curved neck, at the hand upon the railings, and at the border below the dress, end quote. We might want the brown-clad figure of Mengen's sister to be a harbinger of power, but she instead emerges as a fragmented, unnamed other to our narrator, submissive to the external force of the lamplight and sexualized by the boy's psyche. In his description of the girl, Joyce shifts earlier references to her brown figure to this later manifestation of her brown-clad figure, offering her brownness as both her actual body and a dress that the boy narrator fantasizes about removing. Again, her brownness is external, part of the exterior description of her image, similar to the descriptions of the domestic exteriors that open the story. She reflects his adolescent sexual desire back to him, offering him a partially blinded glimpse of a version of the interior self, mistakenly believed to be liberated by internal mobility, but actually limited by an external world that he cannot fully access. Mangan's sister's body, the brown-clad houses, and the vases at the bazaar that the boy clearly cannot afford are all symbols of the boy's position as an outsider, even though he is the main Irish Catholic figure in this story. Joyce suggests that Irish Catholicism will keep Ireland excluded from all versions of otherness to their own detriment. It will limit their access to diversity and to an understanding of a fully manifested identity as both a nation and a people. Not surprisingly, especially if you have read all of Dubliners and you finished it and you got to that last story, which is by far, in my opinion, the best. Not surprisingly, the dead is the tool I use to crack open my students' recognition of their own regional struggle. Similar to the boys' struggle in Araby, my students wrestle with the modern and the traditional, the educated but provincial and immobile experience of becoming rooted in New England. I sell the dead as a fancied up version of the recognizable heteronormative experience that crude hipsters of my era would call a cock block. I tell them that what's at stake in this story is the consummation of an idealized future where progressive but blind politics must recognize itself in the parts of its demographic that it does not understand, and worse, does not realize it does not understand. Finally, I urge them to see what Gabriel Conroy can't, that recognizing and maintaining gender, class, race, and political differences while seeking equality is essential to cultural awareness and was foundational, in Joyce's view, for Ireland's future success as a decolonized nation. Nationalism and the white supremacy that comes with it is the sound of snow falling on graves, erasing the past and us with its cold whiteness. While Gabriel will always be one of my first loves in the Joycean universe, I make this point best in class through the character of Freddie Malins. Just as Shakespeare's fools ironically invoke elemental words of wisdom, Freddie's drunken questions about American Blackness at the dinner table in The Dead presents a diagnosis of an Ireland that cannot move forward into modernity without recognizing the multiplicity of cultural voices that overtly challenge nationalist calls for a unified declaration of Irish Catholic identity. While much contemporary criticism persuasively argues that Joyce was a radical nationalist, I urge my students to read Joyce as a writer deeply engaged in critiquing the more traditional tenets of Irish nationalism, while simultaneously invoking otherness as a tool that sometimes, but not always, offers an authentic voice of Irish selfhood. This version of selfhood can be similarly categorized within what Marjorie Howes in semi-colonial Joyce calls, quote, alternative narratives of the nation, end quote, where characters like Gabriel Conroy and Stephen Dedalus, quote, reject the conventional forms of national belonging offered to them by cultural nationalism, only to end up postulating other alternative national discourses. Consequently, in Dubliners, Joyce interrogates whiteness as a signifier of shallowness and limitation when the characters in his stories consistently do not recognize, quote, that the color of the race problem is white, end quote, as Robert Jensen posits in his essay Whiteness in the Routledge Companion to Race and Ethnicity. Instead, the characters' whiteness reflects inadequacy and disappointment as much as it leads them to overlook the violence encoded in their whiteness. This critique of whiteness is the center of Joyce's critical focus on proto-national Catholic identity. In a radical early move against racist tropes of modernization, Joyce warns against collapsing whiteness and Irishness in the pursuit of colonial subjectivity. David Lloyd endorses this critique in his important defense of the Irish as non-white in relation to Britain, where he points out that, quote, fictive as we have learned race to be, it would be a mistake not to recognize that that which it designates is a fulcrum for resistance, even as it is an alibi for domination, end quote. In Joyce's critique of Catholic nationalism in Dubliners, he points out the exploitive dependency on otherness, often orientalized in the imagination of his characters to fuel nationalist sentiments, and questions the presupposed alliance with whiteness that might be keeping Irish identity from modern progression. And he absolutely also does this in Ulysses, which explains a number of censorship concerns that go way beyond, I think, the pornographic concerns of the text. Recognizing the insidious relationship between whiteness and national identity functions as a Wildian mirror for my students. And when my pedagogy works, they see their own faces in the glass and rage against those reflections. Perhaps no other story in Dubliners places whiteness at the center of its narrative with the same sense of urgency as The Dead. The famous line, "Snow was general all over Ireland," rings true from the beginning of the story to the bitter end, when Gabriel must decide how to interpret the life-changing revelation he has about his wife that could decode his role in the future nation. While this story takes place inside the domestic interior of the Morkins home for the most part, it is the exterior, snow-covered landscape of the missing nation that slowly penetrates the home, sneaking in through modern conventions like galoshes, tapping on window panes, reminding Gabriel how suffocated he feels, and ultimately teaching Gabriel about love when Greta tells of Michael Furey's death from exposure to the harsh conditions of the winter countryside. The sheer whiteness that the snow represents is impossible to ignore once we are faced with Freddie Mallon's question at dinner regarding the partygoers' silence surrounding a questionable American musician. Quote, "Is it because he's only a Black?" End quote. Freddie Mallon's and Gabriel Conroy are doubled from the earliest moments of The Dead, when they are both late for the party, and the aunts wonder when Gabriel will arrive. They do not worry about Freddie because, quote, "Freddie Mallon's was always late," end quote. Freddie is Joyce's Shakespearean fool, a character who seems to only have a bit part in this tragedy of Gabriel's epiphany, but one who reminds us how the silence on race in the domestic interior of the story is paralleled in the exterior world by the tapping of whiteness from the snow outside. The aunts think that Gabriel will be able to handle Freddie's drunk behavior and worry about Gabriel's lateness because of his needed role as caretaker. But Joyce shows us that this is a ruse. In his interactions with Molly Ivors, Freddie Mallon's, and even his own wife, Greta, Gabriel Conroy brings silence. He stifles conversation and misreads intentions enough to render other characters silent and, at times, emotionally overwhelmed. Instead of making speeches, Freddie Mallon's asks questions. And for Joyce, this is how Ireland should begin to break down its silence on the lack of difference, keeping it isolated as a colony and future nation. For my students, this is how we confront the overwhelming whiteness in our classroom and break the silence that historically links whiteness with economic entitlement in our supposedly progressive landscape of southeastern Massachusetts. As the story's presiding cockblock, Michael Furey helps us to understand how whiteness and blindness are overlapping metaphors in The Dead. And students are driven to interrogate the power of Michael's haunting role as the ghost of Ireland's past, an old boyfriend whose memory competes with Gabriel's romantic inclinations for Greta's attention. The whiteness surrounding Michael even before the story begins sounds the death knell of a devotion to anything with the force that Michael is devoted to Greta, or the way that Molly Ivors is devoted to nationalism. Michael Furey's misdirected devotion to Greta as a metaphor for the future nation is symbolized through his frozen body and snow-covered grave. The whiteness of death in The Dead is the mark of erasure of both self and other, leaving no choice for Gabriel but movement away, possibly emigration westward in the end. Freddie's question about race during dinner falls on deaf ears because Dubliners in The Dead are defined by the whiteness covering their potential nation. They miss the brilliance of Freddie's question because they disregard him as a drunk, marginalized outsider, undeserving of a voice. Joyce warns against this exact perception, suggesting that it is in fact Gabriel who is blind to the progression of modernity in Ireland, not Freddie. Gabriel's blindness, like the snow, permeates every scene of the story, from the dance with Molly to the dinner table speech, to the moment he notices Greta on the stairs and cannot think of her name. Gabriel cannot see what Freddie clearly and adamantly articulates as the central problem in Irish thinking, demarcated by the stories in Dubliners. To speak about Blackness or queerness or otherness as anything more than an exoticized figure to be consumed by the Irish in their quest for national identity is to expose a possible camaraderie that betrays the power of difference and marginalization rather than the strength of national unification. In the Black and Green Atlantic, David Lloyd clarifies the paradoxical racism of the Irish in the United States after 19th century immigration by explaining that, quote, race, we may observe, is a variable set of structures, not a quality. And as the place of the Irish in that structure changed, or as they entered into a new racial matrix, so both the nature of their own racialization and their relation to other races inevitably altered, end quote. Lloyd draws attention to the identity struggle the Irish underwent as a population that knew both colonization and racial subjugation on the other side of the Atlantic when they immigrated to the United States, and their whiteness offered them privilege through its definability as specifically not Black. This kind of privilege is similar to the presumption of whiteness that Joyce understood to be holding Ireland back from its development as an independent and modern cultural leader. The same privilege is often the defining force of whiteness in public university classrooms in Massachusetts, where an inheritance of Irish pride remains strong and can be both inspiring and debilitating for my working class white students. In a post-famine, pre-revolutionary Ireland, James Joyce saw clearly that Ireland's inability to recognize its own Ireland's inability to recognize its own otherness would keep it from the cultural development needed to move beyond traditional nationalism to a model of alternative national thinking, a space where a nation is, quote, and this is a famous quote from Ulysses, the same people living in the same place or also living in different places, end quote. My main goal when I teach Joyce is to make sure my students understand that living in different places can be both a geographical and an emotional or ideological experience for both white students and students of color. And we must work to eliminate the silence blinding us to a long history of racial privilege that keeps those experiences separate and isolated in our local communities and classrooms. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I had told everyone the chat was enabled, and it was, but apparently it got disabled. So I've re-enabled the chat. So you can put any questions, comments there. You also should have the ability to unmute yourselves as you move into the discussion portion.
I'm not sure if we are leading discussion or not, but you should feel free to ask questions, all of you. And you should not feel in any way that your questions need to be perfect or well thought out. Feel free to jump out with whatever you're thinking, and I'm sure Barry and I would be happy to respond to them.
And feel free to ask questions about any of the Dubliner stories. If you read them and are curious about something, ask about any of them. We've read them all many times.
And I've studied for the event, so I'm ready.
So we have a comment in the chat from Kathleen. I'm reminded of the commitments. The Irish are the Blacks of Europe, and the Dubs are the Blacks of Ireland, and the Northern Dubs are the Blacks of Dublin.
Yeah, that's a great comment. I teach the commitments in my modern Irish culture class all the time. And I go back and forth between showing the film version and not showing the film version because it's so very fun. But yeah, I mean, Roddy Doyle very clearly had a sense of the sort of racial identity that was problematizing Dublin in the 80s and 90s before the Celtic Tiger, and thinking about how class and money and the working class position of many Dubliners connected them or seemed to connect them to the racial struggle in America. So that's a wonderful observation.
Yeah, I also thought that was a great observation. Roddy Doyle, I think more than most other writers in Ireland that I know of today, is not afraid to tackle issues of race. When I was at UCD, I was able to go see a performance of Synge's Playboy of the Western World that was directed by Roddy Doyle and adapted by Roddy Doyle. And he shifted the characters from the difference between being from Dublin in the city and West Ireland to characters within the neighborhood in northern Dublin, being native Irish people and immigrants. And so that the same play with the same dialogue was able to allow us as audiences to see race in an entirely new way in this Irish work.
Dell asks, did you like Duffy in A Painful Case? I thought he was a bit unbelievable, and if so, why did Joyce create him?
So I'm assuming, Barry, that I should answer these questions, but I also want you to answer them because it's fun to talk. Unless you don't want to, it's fun to talk back and forth.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great question because that story is always, I think, so challenging because of its subtext of what it doesn't say, right? Which is, a storyline about queerness, actually. And so it's interesting because, you would be curious as to which audience members in reading Dubliners, so which readership would really pick up, I think, on this question of sexuality, but that story very provocatively, I think, brings that out. So I think in some ways, Joyce creates that character and writes that story to put queerness and a question of heteronormativity, so a question of like this kind of, compulsive marriage that Catholicism is forcing in Ireland, into the center of his ongoing conversation about otherness in Dubliners. So it's not just about race, it's also very much about what's going on with people's sexuality, what's going on with the church. And I think Mr. Duffy, and I can't help, I have to call him Mr. Duffy, is at the center of that.
And I love Mr. Duffy as a character just because of the way Joyce presents him as kind of living outside of his own experience. He almost seems afraid to experience his own life. And I can't remember the exact phrase, but there's a really beautiful phrase Joyce uses early in the story, and said that that Mr. Duffy lived a pace apart from his body or something like that. And I think the story that is kind of surrounded by this tragedy of Emily Sinico and her ultimate suicide is also about Duffy not being able to confront his own identity, not being able to confront his own fears and his own, what we would say today, his truth about himself. So it's a great question. I actually really love Mr. Duffy just because he's such an example of someone kind of living outside their own experience like that.
So Patrick asks, and you're going to have to pardon my pronunciation on this, what are your thoughts on the use of the Lass of Aughrim in The Dead as a way of using previously existing art and music to bring attention to the problem of silence, especially when it comes to having children out of wedlock?
Great question. Many different ways I think of responding. The first, I would say that Joyce is, I don't even know if it's his second love. I think it's his simultaneous love to language is music. So James Joyce, super well trained as a musician, understood so much about music, wrote so much about music, performed music. So it's everywhere. And when you read Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, it's almost impossible to pick up the cadence of those texts without like hearing a certain rhythm that's definitely musical. I think The Lass of Aughrim is really important to that story because it gives us insight into what we think Greta struggles with the most on a personal level outside of her relationship with Gabriel, that might be even more so than this love that she had with Michael Fury. I think it's probably also important there in the story because the story is very much about confronting this traditional understanding of nationalism as the savior for Ireland, and Joyce saying that it's really not. And I think Joyce wants in some ways to take traditional things, so music being one of them, and kind of confront them in this story and think a little bit about how that image of this kind of traditional in some ways, not provincial, but traditional. There's another word I'm trying to think of, pastoral, that's the word, version of Ireland, that Yeats and others thought could reestablish this vision of the nation. Joyce wants very much to think about that as not the answer. He wants it to be part of the answer, but not the full answer. I mean, there's got to be some sort of understanding there. And I think the Lass of Aughrim being about Greta's personal experience makes it essential to that narrative outside of the Molly Ivors version of nationalism, which is also the Michael Fury version of nationalism. And neither one of those characters make it to the end of the story. So to me, it's very much about Joyce's struggle with how to sort of posit nationalism as slightly necessary, but not the absolute impetus to how we develop the nation. Sorry, that was too long.
That was wonderful. I want to add a little bit to that regarding Joyce and his use of music. I've spent a lot of time in the manuscripts and the drafts of Ulysses. And through the drafting process, you can see Joyce going back into the text and weaving music into the characters' lives and into the characters' personalities. And at every step of the way, he's adding more and more music. And very often, kind of like with the Lass of Aughrim and Greta Conroy, he attaches music to certain characters to help characterize them. He's kind of relying on us as readers to not only read the literature, but to understand the music that is helping kind of set the soundtrack for what's happening in these scenes. It's a really beautiful construction.
You know, Barry, you just made me think. I see at least one of my students here. Hi, Sadie. This makes me think of the fact that Bartel D'Arcy, who's in The Dead, and I think is singing The Lass of Aughrim at a moment in the party. Am I right? Does he perform it?
I think he is singing it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's when Greta's on the stairs thinking about Michael Fury. He reappears, right, in the Penelope episode of Ulysses as one of Molly's suitors, right? Doesn't she like hook up with Bartel? We just studied this, Sadie, the other night, so this is interesting to me. And I think in that way, Joyce also often connects music to women and the female psyche in his writing as well. He does have a way of kind of bringing that sense of artistry, musicality, anything that's non-linear to his, I think, characterization of women and the way he portrays female characters and female figures.
Mary asks, would you also see Mangan's sister as a personification of Ireland, with the narrator's obsession with her representing the Irish nationalist idealized view of freedom, even though their narrow view of Ireland did not align with how complex Ireland actually was?
Yeah, yes, I do see that. I think that Joyce is actually being a little bit critical of that. I think that Joyce is actually saying that the boy narrator is kind of really interested in seeing Mangan's sister as this reflection of the nation that he identifies with, but sexualizes. So there's like a double thing happening there, right? Where she does in some ways represent this, but she also represents the sort of Irish push to do this in a way that they identify as nationalist or maybe even white. So yeah, I think you're onto something there. I think that Joyce is actually very critical of that. It's sometimes difficult, I think, when actually, I should say it's always difficult when reading Joyce, even I think to really well-established scholars, to always pay attention to that indirect discourse and from whose perspective these stories are coming from, because we get a sense that there is at times a kind of omniscient narration, but there never really is. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges of reading Joyce, is that even when you're in the third person, you're not really in the third person. And so he really wants to push us to always think about language as having perspective. So just as much as he's giving us the boy's perspective when we look at Mangan's sister, or he's giving us Gabriel Conroy's perspective when he's blushing and getting embarrassed about being misunderstood, he's also, as a writer, using those figures to then critique, right? He doesn't love them. He doesn't love the boy in Araby, just like he doesn't love Gabriel Conroy. He wants us to put pressure on those figures and see them as representative of something that we need to question, that we need to be critical of.
Yeah, and Mary, this is such a great question, because I hadn't really thought about Mangan's sister in this way before, like I have with other female figures and their representation of Ireland. And I think famously Yeats, in his, and Lady Gregory mostly, and Kathleen de Houlihan connected Ireland with this female figure. And Joyce pushes back against this in many ways. So I think Mangan's sister absolutely can fit into that category. But in Dubliners, we also see in Two Gallants the image of the harp that is described as female. With, I can't remember the phrase, the cover of the harp is sitting on the ground at the base of the harp, and he describes it as her skirt around her ankles, as a representation of kind of this very, very Irish symbol, kind of being feminized and also kind of criticized at the same time. So I think Joyce is very much kind of criticizing this this view of Ireland that comes from the Irish literary Renaissance.
Yeah.
We have more coming into the chat. So Douglas would like you to comment on Joyce's use of epiphany and the line between Gabrielle and Alfred Prufrock and other modernist males who have failed to actualize their lives.
Wow, you are really going for it with that question. That's a great question. I could talk about it until the cows come home. And if you're from Ohio, I know you know what that statement means. My New England students do not know what until the cows come home. They always look at me like, what are you talking about until the cows come home? But I know that you guys know what I mean when I say that. Yes. So I think that there's something like sort of very disappointing about epiphany in Joyce, because it's actually never really epiphany. And you have to remember that Joyce scholars are very controversial in the way that they talk about this. So you have a number of people who think that, and maybe not so much anymore, but who think that epiphany really does happen for Gabriel at the end of the dead. I'm of the other group where I see Dubliners about the lack of epiphany, right? So this is a series of stories about failed epiphanies. And this is James Joyce really, really wishing that those epiphanies would come true and really pushing Dublin to think about how it might recognize things that it just otherwise can't see. And so for me, it's about a failed epiphany, right? And so if you want to connect that to Prufrock, it's very interesting because Prufrock definitely also does not have that epiphany. We don't know what happens, right, when he wakes up and then drowns. We're not really sure what happens at the end of that poem, but we do know that his sense of masculinity, and that's a really good way, I think, of connecting this, his sense of masculinity is really troubled by modernism. I mean, Eliot shows that fragmentation of the self that comes about from the war, and if you know, I mean, just those of you who maybe don't know what I'm talking about, modernism is considered at its height in the 1920s when we're between the wars. So we're between World War I and World War II. And after World War I, we see an intensity of mechanized warfare. Eliot is writing Prufrock and Joyce is writing Dubliners before that, right? So these things are coming out before World War I, but yet they're still understanding the psychology that then rings true after the war that shows the fragmented self as the center of the subjective experience of the modern. It might sound very high art, but it's not really. All it is I think an explanation of a loss of wholeness or unification that never really existed in the first place. If you're a modernist like me, at least that's how you read it. If you're a modernist like W.B. Yeats, though, you read it as something that needs to be reunified. So something that maybe was unified, broke apart, and needs to come back together. And Joyce would say that's not true. And Eliot would say that's not true. They would say that disunified sense of self, that broken, fragmented self, and in those two characters, fragmented masculinity, is in fact the heart of the modern condition. And I think very much forecasting, the problems that we will have to face in the 20th century, especially when it comes to gender and sexuality.
Excellent. I'll tackle that too a little bit, Doug. And I want to recognize Doug as being a former professor here at Heidelberg University, whose office I occupied upon my coming here.
No wonder that was a smart question. I was like, what academic is asking this question? Because I know that it's one of us. I hear it.
Absolutely. And I absolutely expected a question like this from Doug, which is fantastic. I have a slightly different take on Gabriel and Prufrock. I'd always seen them, and kind of using your term, Ellen, about fragmented masculinity. I always saw that Gabriel was completely unaware until the very end of his own fragmented masculinity. He seemed to have a pretty good concept, or he thought he had a pretty good concept of self going into it, but realized that he was fooling himself. But Prufrock from the very beginning seems very aware of his fragmentation, very aware of his shortcomings and his fears, where Gabriel doesn't seem to recognize that he should even have fears. But I love that you put these two in conversation with each other. Now I want to teach these two in conversation with each other. That's a really wonderful way to look at these characters.
So Christy would love to hear you discuss Joyce's choice of names in The Dead. Michael Fury is hypermasculine and Gabriel being biblical. How do you think the choice of names reinforces Joyce's argument about the roles of race and religion in a modern Ireland?
Christy, just to be clear, is also a former student of mine who also then went on to get a master's degree at Boston College. So I think she might be either trying to throw me a curveball here or just wanting to see how I perform under pressure. Christy, what kind of question is this? Yes, well, Christy, but you know, and all of you know, that Michael Fury, while hyper-masculine in the way that you put it, right, is also a biblical name. So we have, and you know how I feel about this, but we have those names, Michael and Gabriel, as our cornerstones of the story, which of course are Old Testament and New Testament angels, right? So then we have one Old Testament angel that fights off the devil and kicks Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden. And then we have one New Testament angel that brings the message and brings us Jesus and our Savior, right? I think the use of those names really plays off of each other, because I do think that, and you know how I feel about this because you've heard me speak about it until the cows come home, but I do feel that Michael Fury is very harshly judged in this story. I don't think that we're supposed to dislike him per se, but I think we are supposed to see him as the death of Ireland, and the death of the Ireland that makes the wrong decision, that runs out in the middle of the night with the wrong set of clothes in a snowstorm to seek a woman who he can't be with, only to then die before anything can come from it. I think that Joyce sees, much like that, any kind of Old Testament claim to religious patriarchy as violent and unnecessary. Like, I think Joyce would be very critical of that kind of, and that word fury, of course, brings us back to it. He's very critical of that kind of Old Testament version of a God that would be so driven with damnation in that way. But that doesn't mean that he thinks that Gabriel Conroy is the end all be all. He just thinks that Gabriel has some hope, and we have to get to it. Like, Gabriel's got to learn, he's got to figure this out. And so he might be our messenger angel, and you've heard me talk about this, but just as he is our messenger angel, he has a lot to learn himself. And I think that and Barry, you put it so well when you said that we see him in the beginning of this story, and I think it's true, as he kind of swaggers, right? Like, there's this sense that he knows. And to me, I read that as he knows that, like, he's going to get time alone with his wife at the end. And like, that's what this is all about. Like, he's going to kiss the ants, make the toast, say hi to Freddie, and take care of everyone so he can go to the hotel, which is where he really wants to be from the beginning of the story, and hook up with his wife, because they've got kids. I've got kids. I know how this is. And they need to be alone. And he decides this is the important thing. But Greta, she doesn't, right? There's like this misunderstanding and thing that happens with Michael. So if we're thinking, Christy, about Michael and Gabriel as really not being in that allegorical symbiotic relationship as they are in the Bible, we can see that, I think, of Joyce's critique here, that those two things actually don't result in the allegory that the Bible might give them to us as. That for Joyce, they're actually working in some ways against each other. Sorry, that might have been roundabout, but Barry, what do you think about this?
I want to touch on the aspect of the names and name choice that Joyce uses. And in the Rosenbach manuscript of Ulysses, which is the collection that John Quinn assembled over several years by collecting episode by episode from Joyce, in the Hades episode, he refers to Molly Bloom, whose real name is Marion. Her name is Marion Bloom. Her maiden name is Tweedy. In the Rosenbach manuscript, he calls her Marie Marr, and Meagher. And so I spent about 2 months in grad school going down this rabbit hole of chasing down, the name Marie Marr and why he might have chosen that name, but why he chose Marion Tweedy instead of that. And I ended up collecting 40 or 50 pages of notes that I wasn't able to wrangle into anything coherent. But Joyce's choice of names is something that you could see him wrestling with as he wrote. It was kind of part of his active writing process to tweak names and to change names. So it's a really interesting question, bringing the names themselves and what they mean for the characters and how they may or may not, like Ellen said, live up to the allegorical expectations that they have.
Okay, so Dell says, our reading group argued about Clay. Was it even a good story? Why did he include it? Was it just a person he'd seen in his life and decided to record? Or was it about the agency of women?
I guess I can jump in here first. I love the story Clay so much. To me, it starts out as, and it kind of finishes as a Halloween story. The main character, whose name escapes me right now, what was that?
Maria, is that?
Yes, Maria or Mariah. I'm not sure how Joyce would have pronounced her name. But she's described at the beginning of the story almost like a witch, riding this carriage to the house of her former employers. And then throughout the process of the story, we see that the kids engage her in playing this game, and they play this trick on her, by having her reach in and feel this clump of clay that is ultimately heartbreaking. So we start out with this story that's kind of set up as a Halloween story, and it ends in forcing this poor character Mariah into facing her own fears and facing her own shortcomings in her life. I think I'm getting kind of shaken up just talking about it, but I really love this story, and it really kind of touches me in the kind of the tragedy of Mariah in the story.
I mean, it's a heartbreaking story.
Yeah.
And it's I can understand arguing about it. For those of us who are just like in our Joyce bubble, which is not a good place to be, so I'm not recommending this, but when you're in that Joyce bubble, it's hard to, and Barry, especially having studied the manuscripts, it's hard to get to a place where you don't see every word, every article, every punctuation point as absolutely essential to what this man is writing. So it's hard to imagine him not including Clay. To me, one of the things that Clay does and signifies so intensely is really just the brokenness of the family in Dublin at this time. And many of these stories show this. I think when we teach these stories to young people, like at the high school level, when people are reading Dubliners, we oftentimes don't focus, or maybe we underrepresent the role of abuse and violence, oftentimes, domestic violence in these stories. There are two really important things in Clay that come out. One is alcoholism, which is really essential because the brothers that Maria has raised, and she is not their mother, but she was their nanny. The brothers no longer are speaking. And there's a sense that drinking and the drinking that they do in the story leads to some of this and explains some of this violence. But also Maria works in something that's very similar to a Magdalene laundry. And that's like a real, so when you asked if it was about women, it is very much about women, but it's also about the dissolution of the family at the heart of, unfortunately, the Catholic agenda in Ireland, which is really to sort of say that they're taking care of women who exist outside of the heteronormative family unit. When they're not, they're exploiting them. And we know that now from much work that's been done on Magdalene laundries and done on women and children in Ireland. But when Joyce was writing, I mean, it's incredibly progressive. for him to portray the sort of sadness of this woman who is both outside of the family and outside of the church. I mean, there's a real, there's a real darkness, I think, to that.
And also outside of the culture, the society in which she's lived, she's kind of being cast aside. Absolutely. Actually, and this reminds me, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here, but the Dell's questioning of why this story was even included was my reaction to the story Ivy Day in the committee room. I struggled for years as an undergraduate with Ivy Day, and it wasn't until I was in my master's program that I had just gotten off of a study abroad in Italy where we read Dante's Inferno, actually all of Dante's Divine Comedy. But then one of the first reading assignments we had in my master's program was Ivy Day in the committee room. And I suddenly began to see parallels between Inferno and Ivy Day. And suddenly it just became one of my favorite stories. The deeper I dug into it, the more I kept seeing Ivy Day as an allegory for the ninth circle of hell, of betrayal, and how everybody in this room had betrayed Charles Stewart Parnell at one point in their lives, or one point in this conversation. And so I think these stories that confound us, these stories that kind of make us wonder why they're there, are invitations to go back into the story, to figure out what it is. When I teach poetry to my students, the lower division students, I always tell them that with poetry, the difficulty is sometimes the point, that it's forcing us to stop, it's forcing us to pay more attention and to dig a little bit deeper. And that's what I love about Joyce, is he forces us to do that so often, to stop and slow down and pay attention to these fine details and to kind of dig in a little bit deeper.
And Dell also commented, we also had a real hard time with Ivy Day.
Understandably so,
yeah. And just following up, do you think going back and reading the portrait is a good idea if you had trouble with Ivy Day?
Going back and reading Portrait of the Artist? Is that what I assume?
That was, Dell just kind of added on. Yes. Dell says yes.
I am one of those Joyceans that even though I have read Portrait of the Artist many times, I can't force people to go back and do that, because it is my least favorite Joyce text. So no, I don't think you must go back to Portrait to read Ivy Day. I think you really only need to know two things about the importance of Ivy Day in the committee room. And the first is that there's a bottle of beer on the mantle that is about to burst, and there's no corkscrew. And that metaphor in this story is super important, because they deliver this big case of beer and they fight hard to get it in the midst of this political moment. And they can't open it because they don't have a corkscrew. And so they sit it on that mantelpiece and they wait. And while they're waiting, they have all these political conversations, and they talk about this and they talk about that. And they're all really essential, I think, to how we understand Joyce's take on Parnell. But what's more important is to recognize that the missing corkscrew is also the missing impetus for the Easter Rising, and that things are rising in Dublin constantly while Joyce is writing this collection of stories. And it's just going to be any moment that it's going to burst. I mean, he foresaw, that doesn't mean he completely endorsed it, but he knew that there was revolution. And the question was when, right? And if we don't have a corkscrew for it, if we can't figure it out, and if we can't unlock it, we just put it in the fire and wait for it to burst. And when that happens, when that bottle of Guinness bursts, right, there's this really important moment in the story where we recognize that camaraderie, where people drink together. And I think that for Joyce, that's a really important metaphor. Alcohol always kind of becomes a representation. I mean, it's unfortunate because Joyce actually was a raging alcoholic. I mean, he died with all of, you probably know this, Barry, from doing so much work, but he died with all of his teeth infected. Like, he could barely eat because of that. He was, he struggled with drinking excessively, but he also understood the role between drinking and violence in Ireland, and he represented it in his stories. I mean, alcoholism and violence go hand in hand, and in Ivy Day, it's very much, that's a part of it.
Scroll back up here. Our next question is from Wendy, and as we were just gathering at the beginning, was Wendy the person who mentioned she's joining us from Japan? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so just to give a little context, Wendy asks, how does this literature inform the healing that could be said to be needed in the US? That is it because he's only a Black? Especially, what challenges come into having free and open academic discussions that you lead with the students? What are the students saying about race, otherness, gender, and freedom of sexual identity? And she notes this question is from a descendant of Irish immigrants who are only good enough to haul trash in Philly.
Yeah, I mean, so I would say, Wendy, that you have your finger on the pulse, because I think that that's the question, right? I mean, that's the question that many of us, I don't know that I can answer it fully in the way that you'd like to hear. I wish I could. I think that if I could, we'd be in a much better place. But I don't know that I can. I can say, though, that there's something that happens when you talk about literature from a different period to confront contemporary issues. Nathaniel Hawthorne understood this very well. That's why everything that he wrote was about Puritans, because no one was a Puritan in the 19th century. So he knew that he could talk about American Victorian issues through his critique of the Puritans. Joyce becomes that for us in some ways in my classes. He becomes in some ways that way of talking about contemporary issues by going backwards and thinking about Irish modernity. Part of the reason that it is so profound is because Joyce is writing about a nation that is not yet a nation. And that's very hard, I think, for Americans to think about, because it's next to impossible for students, I think, to comprehend what it's like to be members of a space that is not named a nation. We don't really live in that cultural moment any longer. So this experience and understanding of colonialism is very different, I think, for contemporary students. But that allows distance and a space to have these conversations in different ways. And I think, your comment about hauling trash is really important here. And I don't want to psychoanalyze you, even though, I am a Freudian at heart, unfortunately, and Joyce would not be happy with me saying that. But I do think that class issues are everything for my students. So much more. And Sadie, you can jump in. Christy, you can jump in and tell me I'm wrong here. But the racial struggles that happen in Boston right now are encoded so much in a class struggle, and class struggles in southeastern Massachusetts, which is outside of the Boston metro area, are everything. So my students are thinking about themselves almost first and foremost as struggling with their class position, more so than they would necessarily with their racial identity, although I do think those things are collapsible. And to me, that's where Joyce comes in, because Joyce is very much, I think, trying to tell Ireland, that there is this sense of whiteness or white identity that gets in the way of seeing where the real problems are, and some of those real problems have to do with poverty and sexuality and other forms of oppression, and that we need to sort of, think about how that's encoded in the cultural experience. I think that one of the things that Joyce saw that was so essential, though, was that we needed that role of otherness in what we did. Like Joyce really, there's a reason why Bloom, and I don't know if you've tried to encounter Ulysses. I don't know where anyone is with Ulysses. I would encourage you to, if you want to read it, I would encourage you to just pick it up and read it. Don't worry about what everybody's saying about it, and don't worry about the notes, and don't worry about all that other crap. If you want to go down that rabbit hole, awesome. But otherwise, just pick it up and read it. Because in Ulysses, we have our main characters, and Leopold Bloom he's Jewish, and he's not Catholic, and his father has committed suicide, and he lost a baby, and there's a bunch of stuff going on that makes him very much outside, very much marginalized. And his wife is partially Spanish, and she comes from a different understanding also of what it means to be Irish. And for Joyce, that otherness is very much important. It's how he sees the future of the nation. He sees it as much more of an American prototype of a mosaic than what it becomes. Eamon de Valera and what happens after the Easter Rising is Joyce's worst nightmare. Like, he really does not want Ireland to be this place of national unification that it becomes, and this sort of sense of absolute collapse of church and state with Catholic identity being at the core of it. That's not what Joyce would have envisioned for a modern world. And I believe he probably turned over in his grave 500 million times until 1999 or 1998, when we finally get that Good Friday Agreement and we move out of the Celtic Tiger into a different place. Right now he's celebrating, but he didn't throughout most of the 20th century because it's not what he thought Ireland should have done.
And someone commented, as a tutor of moving image who uses Citizen Kane to break open otherness and gender under the canopy of semiotics and decoding, it's great to hear that Dubliners is used similarly.
You're muted, Ellen.
I know, I'm trying to unmute myself. I should probably just leave myself unmuted. I just get nervous because I have children here and they scream. And so I worry that it will disrupt us. That's a really smart comment because, Joyce and Barry, more, in terms of the archival stuff than I do, but, Joyce was very interested in cinema. And didn't he buy a theater? I feel like Joyce bought a theater or something. It failed, I think.
He started a theater in Dublin that failed spectacularly, that
Right.
Dublin wasn't quite ready for cinema when he opened the theater. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I do think that Joyce very much thought like a cinematographer. I mean, these stories, and people have written about this. I cannot claim any of this, but these stories are very much like glimpses of film, and they unfold that way. And if you've seen John Huston's version of The Dead, which is a really a cinematographic masterpiece, although students won't like it because they will think it is extremely boring. But if we watch it, right, and you've probably seen it since you're asking this question, there's something about Joyce's work that lends itself very much to cinema. I mean, it's kind of beautiful in that sense. I also think, though, that there's something modern about that. And I don't want to get too academic, but in like the Walter Benjamin, what's going on with the aura, what's happening in the age of mechanical reproduction, I think that a lot of these modernist writers are thinking, and I think, did I lose Douglas? No, Doug is here. So Doug, your question made me think about it. Like they're thinking about fragmentation from that sense of the loss of self, as then reflected in the power of photography and reflected in the power of cinema, the power to fragment. And then, later in the century, they would have been really happy with people who, like Laura Mulvey, who were writing about The Graduate and the fragmented images of Mrs. Robinson on the screen. I think the modernists, Joyce would have been really impressed by what cinema can do. I think he would have thought that it was like capable of representing the reality of the split self better than maybe even other genres.
I agree with that 100%. And your question, whoever admin is, takes me right into Ulysses and the Circe episode. And that episode is the longest episode in the book. It's written in the form of a play, but it's clearly not a play because these things can't be staged. And your point about using the moving image to break open otherness and gender, etc., is exactly what Joyce is doing in this episode. I think he very much had film in mind and the potential for film in mind when he created this, because characters experience instantaneous costume changes, instantaneous set changes that expose these very concepts of otherness and gender, and characters who were mostly Bloom, who is confronting fears and confronting his own inferiority in the face of this kind of semi-drunken hallucination that he's having through this entire episode. So connecting Joyce and cinema in that way is spot on. I love that question.
Okay, so from Dell again, apparently they had a row in their reading group about the mother of the boarding house. Was she completely bad, involved her daughter in her connivance? Or was it a thing that was quite commonplace at the time and commonplace in literature?
I guess we want to think about what that thing is. And if the thing is trapping a guy into marrying your daughter, I don't know that it was commonplace. I think people maybe looked upon it concernedly, but there's a lot of controversy about that story. People have this question. I don't think that mother is presented in necessarily a good way, but I also think that the possibility, the potential for women in Dubliners is not good. The outcome isn't good. In that story, I can't. Barry, help me understand where it is in terms of Eveline. Is that story close to Eveline? I feel like it's like on the heels or close to where Eveline is in.
I think it's shortly after Eveline. I don't know if it's immediately after, but I think it is shortly after.
Right. So it's a couple stories after Eveline, but I see it very much in discourse, in conversation with Eveline.
Absolutely.
Just about there being just entrapment when it comes to women's positions throughout the stories. So I don't know. I empathize with the mother there because I think there's a sense that she's trying to figure out a life for her daughter, even though it's totally screwed up how she makes that happen.
Yeah, and her looking out for the future or a future for her daughter, because if her daughter doesn't get married, her prospects in life in Dublin at the time were not good. She very well could have ended up in one of these, Magdalen laundries or one of these workhouses that that so many single women were forced into and kind of isolated from society. So I think she was trying to keep her daughter from the tragedy of that future, which was a very real possibility at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're drawing close here, at least to 8 o'clock in the Eastern time zone. I don't see any other questions. Does anyone watching, we'll give you a last chance here for any questions. If anyone wants to unmute or chat. Rebecca had commented, thanking you all for the fascinating conversations and questions, and says that she will read Joyce with different eyes. And I would say that I think that most of the attendees have come away with some of those perspectives.
As will I. Ellen's paper was so enlightening, and I don't think I'll be able to look at these stories the same way again as I read through them. And that's, for me, one of the magical things about a literary interpretation like this, that we come to these events and talk to our colleagues and hear what our colleagues are doing, and it helps us open our eyes to new readings and new interpretations. And it's just like I commented in my class the other day, that sometimes I can't believe I get paid to do this because it's just so much fun.
I see a hand. I think Robert, do you have your hand up? I see an emoji hand.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Scheible. I appreciate that. I'm Rob Huntington, and I've had the privilege of working with Dr. Collar when I arrived at Heidelberg 12 years ago, and I was lucky enough to be there when Doug decided to retire. And then I was lucky again to meet Dr. Devine, Barry Devine, when he showed up and decided to, which he already mentioned, I think, move into Doug's office upon departure. And that's more than great coincidence. It's wonderfully symbolic, because I've never had a chance to say in front of a group of people that I admire both of them for many, many things, but especially for their passion for great literature and their understanding of literature and their ability and desire to communicate that passion to students and to former students alike. I'm not a student of theirs, but I'm a long ago student. And English was not one of my majors when I was in college. And tonight, I've been really fortunate to meet you, and I would describe you the same way if I had the chance. Incredible. And the fact that a number of your students joined from their new locations, but your former students and your current students really speaks about that. Here's my question, because I'm eminently concerned about how an institution exists today. I'm in my 12th year attempting to be a reasonable president at Heidelberg. And in a world right now that demands preparation for a life that has jobs and careers at the front of what is necessary to get by, most people just have to and want to have jobs like you guys. Those are jobs, those are careers. and people are looking for those. And as Doug and I started a conversation during his time, and Barry's in the middle of it right now, it's hard to make a really compelling case for the more traditional areas of study that have historically been described as the core of the liberal arts, including literature within the study of English literature, and getting specific about Irish literature and so forth. In your views, I'd love if Doug wants to comment, and I know there's actually Dr. Carty, I think, was on here earlier, another great professor at Heidelberg who taught in biology. But how do we continue to bring this type of study, the love of somebody like Joyce, but the study of literature to prepare people for great lives in a world that demands practical application of this education? I think both are great. I like practical stuff. I like things that make the world better. We need to go out and move piles of rocks around and build things and create jobs and do all that stuff. And I believe understanding poetry and studying great literature contributes to that. But it's becoming harder and harder to make the case for it unless you're one of the 75 out of 4,800 universities that have billions of dollars and can fund it regardless of what happens. Heidelberg is not one of those rich schools. And I lived not too far from Bridgewater in your area, so I understand what Eastern Massachusetts is all about. And I married into an Irish Catholic family in Boston, so I appreciate a lot of the subtext of tonight's discussion. Do you guys have any advice? Because this is the reason why, one of the reasons why I'm at Heidelberg, and to try to make it possible to continue to bring this type of study to a world, to young people who are showing up and are not asking for it.
I want to make sure I understand before I go down this path, because I have lots of things I'd like to say. I want to be careful, but Robert, are you telling me that you're the president of Heidelberg?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, okay, great. So I would say that's awesome. What you just said, the way you just asked this question, everything that you just said makes me want to work for you. So the first thing that you do is email me and give me a job. I'd love to work with you. The second thing, though, and the more important thing, is that we teach students that education does not stop at the undergraduate degree. It is extremely important that we put money, time, thoughts, feelings into master's programs. I don't know what Heidelberg's doing. I don't know what their plan is, but we need students to go into MA programs, not PhD programs. They need to go into MA programs, and they need to think about that as the next step in their education beyond their undergraduate degree from the moment that they set foot onto the university campus. And if that means that we need to make 4+1 programs, which I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that, if it means that we need to be more interdisciplinary, I don't care what it means, but we need to get them there. Because when we put them into master's programs, we give them keys to do something else. We give them keys to move out of their class bracket. We give them keys to become whoever they want to be in a master's program. It is extremely important that we market those. That's my number one answer. My number two answer is that, and I hate saying this out loud because I love James Joyce. We all love James Joyce, but we need to think outside the box when it comes to any kind of discipline that's associated with the humanities. The social sciences get it. They get it. The social sciences understand that collaboration is important, that working together to build a university is important. The humanities, unfortunately, still live in silos, and we have to find ways to break that. The problem is that we need universities to back us in it. We need universities to help us form relationships between things like literature and medicine. Creighton University right now has a brand new program, a master's degree in literature and medicine, that is a pathway for students who want to go to med school, because we've heard from the medical profession that English majors actually rank in the top of the folks that they want working for them because they have interpersonal skills. So the humanities need to step up with the help of the university, which means the pocketbook, which means the wallet of the university, to support the humanities in building interdisciplinary relationships outside of the humanities and social sciences so that we can give our students the keys to move into those positions. I don't need my students to go get PhDs in English literature. In fact, I'm not sure that that's what we want the future to be. I'm happy if they do, because it's brought me great joy. I do want my students to get master's degrees, and then I want them to figure out where they want to go next with the power that I've given them. And oftentimes the only way to do that is to understand the cross-disciplinarity of an undergraduate education. We don't do that in a silo. But the problem is that our fields, our worlds, and Barry and I don't teach at Yale, and Barry doesn't teach at Yale. So our tenure process is supported very nicely, I hope, very well by my university is very supportive. I assume Heidelberg is too, but it's the folks who are controlling those processes at places like Yale that make it very hard for the humanities to change. We, in the place where we are, we need to change it because we have the power to do that. So we need to create these interdisciplinary programs. We need to help the humanities step out of the silo, become more collaborative, support undergraduate research. Please, I'm sure you have it because it sounds like your university has everything, but undergraduate research is where we need to put our money and our time and our energy, because that's how we build collaborators out of our humanities students. And we need to do that. So yeah, master's degrees, number one, collaboration, number two, and building the humanities into more cross-disciplinary programs, number three.
Thank you, Dr. Schaible. That was really well stated. Barry, you want to add?
I do, and thank you, Ellen, for that really fantastic response. And I'll add a little bit about what I'm doing here at Heidelberg in terms of exactly what Ellen's talking about. But first, I want to recognize, she mentioned the literature and medicine program, that new program at Creighton University. Matthew Reznicek there is one of my great friends and role models, and he's just an absolute gold mine of information. Yes, absolutely. But I think kind of going back to an earlier part of your question, Rob, you were talking about connecting the study of literature to some of these kind of more practical things that we want students to understand. But both are important. And I think the study of literature and diving deeply into the study of literature, like Ellen did today with her paper, can help us understand why these practical things are important, that literature builds and creates empathy, and it lets us experience different things from different perspectives and understand the perspectives of other people in ways that I'm not sure are accessible in any other way except firsthand experience. And kind of touching on what Ellen was talking about and pushing students toward master's programs, over the last few years here, I've been teaching our English 291, which is called Sophomore Studies in English. And I've been inviting directors of master's programs to come talk to these sophomores as English majors to see what their future can hold, working through the process as an undergraduate and then moving into graduate programs. And we've developed a really fantastic relationship with the University of Findlay. I think 4 of our students are currently attending the master's program there, and I think 2 more are on the way next year. I just helped a student get into a master's program at Texas A&M in science journalism. And I think this step from an undergraduate degree in English to a master's program that's going to help them hone their skills and find their path, I think is essential. And I'm building those relationships, not just with the University of Findlay, but University of Toledo. We've invited them. I've invited a larger university at Ball State University to come talk to our students, people from Ohio State. And I think that's opening students' eyes to being able to see that they can take these skills, they can focus on these skills in the humanities and carry them through to really fascinating careers that engage with them in the ways that they're passionate about. So great question, Rob. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's the question. It's the question. It's what's going to make or break us in our survival in this field. And I would just, if I could just give one little shout out to Irish studies, because if there's a way to understand, one very special and remarkable thing about the study of Ireland, it's that it is inherently, it's just impossible to not be inherently interdisciplinary. It doesn't exist. Literature Irish literature doesn't exist outside of Irish history. Barry knows this, I know this. If you're educated in the field that we do, they give us that degree, but our degree is so much more because we are required to learn so much more, and it moves even beyond history. I mean, right now there's so much ecological and environmental work being done in Irish studies, thinking about the bog, thinking about the EU. And if you think about politics, right? I mean, political science is everything to Irish studies, thinking about Brexit, thinking about borders. There is a way to think in some ways about global area studies as really intrinsic, I think, to where the university goes next. And I'm not just saying that because I'm an Irish studies person, but I'm saying it because regional universities, often our students are the ones that don't get to go abroad and really get to experience that, what it feels to be away from home. They need to, because they need to understand what's available for them to bring back to their communities. I'm not saying they need to leave forever, but I am saying that it's important that they bring things back. And that's something that happens. I think global area studies can step in and make that possible and affordable for students at regional universities, and then build up their communities through it.
Thank you again.
Yeah, I would add to that list is the burgeoning field of medical humanities as well, like what they're doing at Creighton and other places. That when it comes to Ireland and Irish studies, there's a tremendous amount of new fascinating things coming out under the umbrella of medical humanities.
Yeah, well, thank you. The summary there on application, interdisciplinary, and master's program point of impact kind of builds a pyramid across those 3 points that both of you have expressed. I really appreciate it. I'll just conclude by thanking, I'll thank you, Barry, for sending out the invitation to everybody and for allowing people to slide in sideways like myself. And I also, wanted to say to Ms. Escalette, I think there's congratulations to you, because aren't you now part of the Tiffin Community Foundation?
Yes,
That's
I
really
am.
great. I learned about that tonight at our board meeting. Congratulations, Trinity. That's wonderful.
Thank you. It'll be,
You'll make a big impact in our community.
yes.
Thanks
And,
again.
partnerships like this, I envision even more coming from that, as we learn more about our community.
That's great.
When you commented on literature and empathy, I just I put a link in the chat. In our local newspaper, the Advertiser Tribune, our library director, Matthew Ross, just had a column published this week on the role of fiction, and particularly noting that how it can build empathy. So that was very timely. So I put that in there for everyone to look at. And as we wrap up, I just want to let you know that here in our local history collection in the library, we do have some materials on John Quinn that you can come in and browse here in the library. We also have some news articles that are in a binder. And yes. And you mentioned the Pulitzer Prize winning biography, The Man from New York. So our library does not have a copy of this, but I borrowed it from the Fostoria, Cobbish Memorial Library in Fostoria. And so we can get this through the interlibrary loan process. So we've got our contact information there in the chat. If anyone, reach out to our staff, we can show you where those materials are and help you locate them. So earlier, Dr. Devine mentioned that the next event in the John Quinn lecture series will be held this summer. So we'll be focusing on John Quinn's work with T.S. Eliot. And the guest speaker will be Dr. Gary Leonard from the University of Toronto, who will talk about Eliot's masterwork, The Wasteland. And
that's such a score. I'm sorry, I just have to say, Gary Leonard is awesome. Dude, Rob, you need to go to that one too, because he is so awesome. The way he talks, the way he teaches, he's one of my favorite people. Barry, good job.
Thank you. He's phenomenal. He's absolutely phenomenal.
So we will definitely be looking forward to that. And, in thinking, I'm like, okay, well, we'll get a date set and get those books. So here in our public library, we requested over 30 copies of Dubliners. And I was really happy to see, how many copies have been checked out. We had to keep refilling it. So we will be looking forward to that. So I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you to Heidelberg University, the Department of English, and Brooks and Jean Warren Geckler for making this possible. Thank you, Dr. Scheible, for joining us. And just a reminder that a recording of this will be posted on the Department of English website. And so if you missed it or want to go back and watch it again, that will be available there. So we look forward to seeing all of you at, oh, wait, does someone have a question? Kathleen, let me see here.
Yes, I was just putting it in the chat. Do you have a date yet for the talk about Elliot?
We don't have a date yet set. I'm working with Gary Leonard. It's probably going to be sometime in July. So probably mid-July is where we're looking right now. I still need to coordinate our calendars.
And you'll let everyone on the email list know, I hope.
Absolutely.
Oh, so yes, so we look forward to that. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Enjoy the rest of your St. Patrick's Day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Trinity. This was amazing.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Wow, what an amazing way to spend my St. Patrick's Day. I mean, really, Barry, let's do it again tomorrow.
Okay, you're on. I'll invite you to my classes.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.